Welcome back to another edition of the KPBS Cinema Junkie Podcast. I'm Beth Accomando. Today, we're going to talk about real science, and that's R-E-E-L versus R-E-A-L science. So we're going to be talking to some scientists about a series of films that are going to be playing at both the Nat and the Digital Gym, but we are going to get scientists to talk about how real science compares to movie science.
She's alive! Alive!
What would you little maniacs like to do first?
It's all in the name of science.
And I'm not going to listen to any more of your capitalistic, quantum, friggin' dumb, limbo, mumbo jumbo.
Weird science.
First up, I have Michael Wall, who is with the Nat, and one of my favorite guys because he talks about bugs. He's an entomologist, and he talks about how creepy and scary bugs are. So, Michael, what is the program that the Nat has put together?
We're showing screenings of films, and at the beginning of each screening, a scientist is going to provide kind of what we're saying, a context or a lens through which to view the film. In some cases, the scientists will talk a little bit about their own research and how that you can use their research as a lens for the film to view the screening of the film. Or in my case, I won't be talking about my own science as much as the practice of science and how that can inform the way you watch different films.
So somebody thinking about this might think that the Nat is going to a group of scientists to get some very serious films about science. But these are a group of pop culture films that are great fun. And tell me what the films are that are going to screen.
Yeah, first up, we're going to do Altered States. And then after that, we're doing Weird Science. And then later in January is Donnie Darko. And then we're going to finish it off with Flash Gordon.
Pathetic earthlings! Who can save you now?
Flash! Savior of the universe! Strange object imaged in the Imperial Vortex. Flash! You save every one of us!
We wanted to pick films that people might enjoy seeing, on a large screen. We tried to pick sort of cult sci-fi films that we knew there was a good following of and that people enjoyed and wanted to see on the big screen, but that also had obviously an interesting scientific take on them.
If you're in San Diego, I urge you to come see these films. They're going to be on Saturdays. Most of them are at 7 p.m. One on January 21st will be at 4 p.m., and they are alternating between the Digital Gym and the Nat. But if you're not in San Diego, you can listen to these interviews I'm doing and use them as your own personal intros to the films where you can just watch them at home. The fact that these are very pop culture films and are not hard science films, but those are the kind of films that tend to grab kids and kind of are an entry to science for a lot of kids. Because even though Star Wars is not a highly scientific film, I know a lot of people talk about that as being the thing that got them interested in a career in like computers or in science. So are these films like good kind of gateway films to learn about real science?
Right, yeah. So there's actually this interesting kind of hand-wringing within the scientific community about the way scientists are portrayed in films, or not necessarily about how scientists are portrayed, but like Star Wars, people are always like, oh, there's no sound in outer space. You can't hear the Death Star explode. And so it's funny that you do get scientists who are kind of wringing their hands about the portrayal of science, but those very same scientists were often inspired by these same films. Like you said, they were inspired to move into science because of maybe their love of science fiction, or they saw Jurassic Park and got interested in genetics or something like that. So yeah, I do think they're interesting gateways. Some of the ones that we chose are maybe not quite a gateway to science as a gateway to comedy or or various weirdness. But yeah, films certainly can act in that way.
You've run a series of films here at the Nat where most of them have been these kind of 50s sci-fi, science gone wrong kind of films like Them, Wasp Woman. So what was your kind of introduction to science fiction in film? What was the start that you fell in love with these movies and wanted to talk about them?
When I grew up, cable didn't exist, and then even once cable did exist, my parents didn't get it, and so we had like basically the three main networks and then one independent channel. And that independent channel just showed these creature features almost all the time because I imagine the rights for them were cheaper, or for whatever reason. So I grew up watching all these movies from the 50s with giant monsters and science gone wrong. And so that was, I don't know, I just fell in love with it as a kid, and that's the way that I fell in love with sci-fi then as I grew older. But Flash Gordon, I've been trying to find it. That's the film that I'm going to be doing, and my parents gave me this coloring book when I was little, and one of the things was, what if you could create a movie, what would you create it? And I just wrote Flash Gordon, across it because I loved that film so much. When it first came out, I saw it in the theater, and that was totally when we talked about doing this series, I was like, I'd give a body part to do Flash Gordon. I'll figure out a way to do Flash Gordon.
Now, this is not going to be the old Flash Gordon serial that had Buster Crabbe. This is going to be the more recent film that has the famous Queen soundtrack on it.
Flash! King of the impossible! He's for every one of us! Stand for every one of us! He's saving the body and every man, every woman, every child, everybody, Flash!
And I think Academy Award-winning Max von Sydow as Ming. So tell me about the film and kind of the context you're going to put it in.
Yeah, so if you haven't seen the film, I highly, highly recommend you come see the film, and you'll be able to see it on the big screen here at the Nat. And it's just it's campy, and they revel in the camp. And one of the things is sometimes these sort of campy sci-fi movies they have low production value, so that they're not necessarily that interesting to look at, but the production value on this Flash Gordon is really crazy. I mean, the costumes, the soundtrack, the acting, other than Ming, is a little bit maybe not the best on the face of the planet. But I was talking to my wife about this yesterday, that the person that they cast as Flash Gordon, even though his acting isn't incredibly great, he was perfectly cast to be the dumb jock. I said it wasn't probably much of a stretch for him. But yeah, I just love the film so much. And so from a scientific perspective, I was actually thinking, oh gosh, how can I do this film and talk about science? So I was rewatching it, and I was just looking at all kind of the natural history of Mongo, of all the different scenes, all the different people, and thinking of it more in the context of if it was a found footage film. What, as a natural historian, could I learn about the planet Mongo? And that's the lens that we're going to be looking at the film through, is that if it was found footage and you were looking at this as a real alien planet, how would we interpret the evolution of life on Mongo?
That sounds like a lot of fun. Although it sounds like I would prefer you to do a running commentary through the movie on this point.
Yeah, we've done that in the past with some of our creature features, but we're going to steer away from that on this one just because the film is so it's really amazing. I'd hate to interrupt it.
Well, I recently watched it, and the production design is fantastic. The costumes, the production design, the cinematography, some of the special effects and everything. So to see this on the Nat's gigantic screen is going to be amazing. Although this might pair up better with like Altered States because it's a bit mind-altering.
It's visually a very beautiful movie. I mean, it's so bright, and the costumes in it have this weird S&M feel to them, and so yeah, I'm really looking forward to seeing it on the big screen. I haven't seen it on the big screen since it originally came out.
Now, Flash Gordon is inspired by a comic book. Were you ever hooked on the comics?
No, not really. When I was in graduate school, I had to do a lot of kind of tedious measuring of things as part of my dissertation. And so I would often listen to old-time radio just as background to keep my mind busy while I was also measuring things. And I did listen to the old-time radio version of Flash Gordon at that time.
Presenting for the first time in radio the amazing interplanetary adventures of Flash Gordon and Dale Arden. These thrilling adventures come to you as they are pictured each Sunday in the Comic Weekly, the world's greatest pictorial supplement of humor and adventure. The Comic Weekly, now printed in 32 tabloid-sized pages, each page in full 4 colors, is distributed everywhere as a part of your Hearst Sunday newspaper.
It wasn't heavy on the science. It was more Flash saving the day and the Hawkmen howling and stuff.
So in looking at this found footage of Flash Gordon, can you give us a preview of any of the insights you might make into this planet?
The one real thing that grabbed me straight off the bat was that different, I guess you would say, races or ethnicities on Mongo have different colors of blood. So some of them bleed green and some of them bleed red. And so that initially got me thinking, like, okay, well, they've got different types of blood. What does that tell us about the way in which they get oxygen into their body systems? And so it's those sorts of things, by looking like, really at it through the kind of specialized lens of natural history and seeing the kind of morphology of the weird creature that kind of sucks Flash into him when he's down in the bottom of the swamp, and then he gets saved by one of the Hawkmen. How does that relate parallel to creatures on Earth?
For me personally, one of the things that always creeps me out or unnerves me is the sense of a loss of identity. And in Flash Gordon, there's kind of a extreme, ridiculous, where they want to cleanse someone's mind of everything that they are. So what kind of science is that? Is that anything that you can read into?
Yeah, so there's a whole bunch of weird psychic stuff that is in Flash. I mean, Gordon, in terms of that they can communicate through telepathy, and clearly they try to erase Dr. Zarkov's mind.
What are you doing to me? Oh, we're just emptying your mind. What?
We are going to empty your memory, as we might empty your pockets. Doctor.
No, don't do that. Please, I beg you. My mind is all I have. I spent my whole life trying to fill it. Begin.
Is there anything else about the film that stands out that you might want to point out to people?
Again, I would kind of go back to that there are so many different types of people on Mongo, and when you do go back and you look at the old comics, and if you look at a map of Mongo, there's all these different kingdoms and realms, and you've got some that have wings, and then there's the cold area, and in the film you see that portrayed as well. There's these really short people. There's these things that I think they call them lizard men that have eyeballs inside of their mouths, which was I'm not sure what that was all about. But yeah, it's the peopling of Mongo and the differences between those people is something that I'm going to be talking about quite a bit in the film.
Are there any films that you think kind of do science justice? Any movies that you think are good examples of showing real science or the process of getting through real science? Because the other thing movies tend to do is, some scientists will go into the lab and boom, the next day they've discovered some great cure or some, solution to a problem. Yeah,
that is actually a very tough question because there aren't very many good examples because science is a process, right? And it's often a pretty boring process. I talked about that for my dissertation. I spent a lot of time measuring stuff, so much time that I had to listen to yours truly, Johnny Dollar, and a whole bunch of other old-time radio. And so to be able to portray that in a feature-length film, 90 minutes, 120 minutes, is it doesn't make good storytelling, I would say, generally. And so that's why, they can create enough immunizations for the entire planet within, in one day in the lab kind of thing, and for an Ebola outbreak or whatever it might be. And so more often than not, you get these really outlandish portrayals of science. And to me, I don't wring my hands about that because it's part of the suspension of disbelief, that goes into any sort of fantasy or fiction. It's what I what does bother me in terms of the portrayal of science in movies isn't necessarily the unrealistic, happenings, as much as when scientists are just portrayed really they're not acting like scientists, even though that they are. So the classic example of this is Prometheus.
What are you doing, David?
I'm attempting to open the door.
Wait. We don't know what's on the other side.
Oops, sorry.
Anybody who's on that ship that calls himself a scientist was lying to themselves because they did so many stupid things, throughout the entire film that no scientist would ever do. Those sorts of things tick me off more than, we sequenced the entire genome of this thing in 5 seconds.
The way you talk about that long process reminds me of Edgar Wright talking about Hot Fuzz, and he said the thing about police work is there's a lot of paperwork and it's boring, and so he decided to shoot paperwork like a Michael Bay film with these fast cuts and this music, but basically he was depicting something incredibly dull and boring.
Yeah, exactly, and that's the only way that you could do it, except it would fast cuts of me staring into a microscope for 8 hours, for weeks on end, is going to be pretty boring as well.
If there was a film you could pick to show your kids or something and say, like, hey, Dad's a scientist and this is what it's like, are there any films that kind of show what a scientist is like that you think is, if not a positive representation, at least something that kind of conveys what it is that goes into that kind of work?
There's a variety of the films about some sort of disease outbreak, like Contagion is one, and I can't remember. There's a few different ones about a disease outbreak. And they often have these geneticists or immunologists, people who, are scientists who work for the CDC trying to control the spread of disease. And I can't remember which one. I think it might be Contagion. I remember that portrayal being a good portrayal of a scientist within a film. Now, whether or not that's appropriate for a child, I don't know. It depends on how mature your child is, I guess.
And of some of the kind of more campy films, because you've done a lot of, like I said, the 1950s science gone wrong films. What of those would you highlight for people if they want a companion list of films to watch with this film series? What are some of the other ones you might point out that maybe don't have good science but are interesting in some way or provocative in some way?
Well, one that is very purposefully campy is the Lost Skeleton of Cadavra. I mean, that is, they are purposefully making fun of that style of film. It's a contemporary version of the old creature feature.
You don't believe those old legends about the Lost Skeleton of Cadavra, do you?
Ranger Brad, I'm a scientist. I don't believe in anything.
And their portrayal of science in that is hilarious, because I remember one scene where he's looking through a compound microscope at a rock and he says to his wife or partner, whoever, I'm doing science now. It's a very much now I'm doing science. So I love that film in terms of its campy portrayal of science. When we were looking for different films to do as part of this, I was considering Tremors because that has some interesting entomological parallels to consider, despite how bad Prometheus is. The original Alien has got with the android. What was the android's name?
Oh, Ash.
The portrayal of him, even though he's kind of an evil scientist, his obsession with the alien is really interesting. We're considering looking at Slither as well because, again, as an entomologist, I'm interested in, even though both Tremors and Slither aren't necessarily insect related, they're, buggy. They're little critter related, and there's interesting things to parallels again to the natural world in terms of parasitology or subterranean creatures, all those sorts of things.
When you marry someone, you promise to love them forever.
Baby.
No matter how much they might change.
Right? Baby, what happened to your face?
It's just a bee sting.
From Universal Pictures.
Tree is sick or something?
becomes a film so shocking.
We got a real problem here.
So disgusting.
Don't let him in your mouth!
It will change the face of horror.
Marriage is a sacred bond, for better or worse.
Much worse.
Well, the thing about Slither, too, is it deals with this kind of metamorphosis, which is always creepy because I think the earliest I remember that is Invasion of the Body Snatchers, which as a kid was really scary, this notion that these pods would be dropped and they would slowly transform into you. And, of course, they catch one of these pods at a half-point transformation where it looks just human enough to let you know what's going on. So this notion of metamorphosis and your own body changing is always really creepy.
Yeah, it's kind of goes back to that loss of identity thing, that something's going to take you over in some sort of way. The interesting thing about Hollywood has sort of become more recently interested in parasitism and in the use of parasites to cause this loss of identity and change. I think you and I have talked previously about the video game.
Oh, Last of Us.
Yeah, Last of Us. It used that idea of parasitism to change something, metamorphosize something, to lose its identity, and that has its parallels in the natural world. I mean, there are all these parasites that, basically, these horsehair worms that cause crickets to turn into zombies to drive them towards water. There's parasites that go into snails that cause them to climb up high in a tree so that they'll get eaten by a bird. There's all these weird examples of things taking over bodies. And so if you just naturally extend that to humans, then it gets creepy all of a sudden.
I think that's why I like talking to you, is because your bug world seems to have some of the best examples of horror.
Yeah, exactly. No, it is. And that's what I try to do in terms of science communication is look into my world of science and try to find the parallels that exist between that world and the human world, so that kind of we as humans might be a little bit more interested and a little bit more intrigued and thankful for the natural world.
And why is it that the Nat wanted to do a program like that? Why is it important to kind of take some of these ridiculous pop culture films that barely touch on science, but why did they feel it was an important way to pair real scientists with films, and what's kind of their goal in doing this?
It actually goes back to what you originally suggested about gateways, these being gateways to science, is that we want people who don't normally think of themselves as scientists to feel like that they understand science and appreciate science. There's a lot of talk these days about, the anti-intellectualism of culture and things like that. And if such a thing exists, then the greatest thing that we can do as scientists is to help people understand the process of science better, because it has provided us with countless of opportunities as humans and has the potential to do so much more to improve our lives and the lives of the world, or the entire world's like climate and environment, etc.
And do you also hope that by putting these films into a context, even if it's a silly context like, hey, think of Flash Gordon as a found footage film, which I'm really excited to see. I would have never have positioned it like that. Now I'm thinking about it going like, I'm going to start looking at some of those details differently. But in putting in these kind of contexts, do you hope that people also will go to movies, and whether the films are campy and silly or even serious, like, we've had A Beautiful Mind or Theory of Everything, where you are looking at real scientists or people who have been involved in science, and maybe question some things and maybe look something else up and maybe try to find out more?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, it's particularly weird science and Flash Gordon and even Donnie Darko. They're not explicitly science movies, but yet there's science in them, and there's science in kind of every film. I mean, if I can take Flash Gordon and teach you a little bit about the process of science, then you can probably find science in just about everything. And so, I mean, we hope that people become a little bit more educated and start questioning things a little bit more and have fun with science.
So are there any other films that you might recommend to people if they have kids, are there some films that you might recommend that they show them to maybe give them to make them less afraid maybe of science in school, or to be interested in maybe trying to do that science fair experiment?
Not necessarily films, but I know that a show that my daughter has really enjoyed that I do think has made her more interested in science is the TV show Bones, which is a forensic anthropologist, if you're not familiar with the TV show. And she's a strong woman, and and there's lots of other scientists on there, and it's everything from math to entomology. There's a guy that's their bug guy, and reconstruction of crime scenes. It all has science mixed into it. CSI kind of falls in that same category as well, but we've really enjoyed Bones, and it has legitimately made my daughter more interested in science and certainly less afraid of science.
All right. Well, I want to thank you very much for talking about real science and real science.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
In the basement of one of the country's leading medical schools, Dr. Edward Jessup, candidate for a Nobel Prize, floats naked in total darkness. The most terrifying experiment in the history of science is out of control, and the subject of the experiment is himself. Altered States.
I'm speaking with Bradley Wojtek, who is a professor here at UCSD in neuroscience, and Brad is going to be introducing altered states as part of the NAT's Real Science program. So tell me, how did you get involved with this?
I had actually given a talk at an event here in San Diego about 2 or 3 months ago. It's called Nerd Night. That event is, I guess it's a national phenomenon at this point. It started in New York City. I had done a couple of these up in the Bay Area a number of years ago, and San Diego finally started a Nerd Night event a couple months ago, and I was asked to give a talk there, and one of the members of the NAT, the person running the actual event, he was in the audience, and he sent me an email and said, would you like to be part of this? And of course I said yes, because it's super exciting.
And did you get to pick the actual film?
Yeah, so they told me a little bit about the background of the idea, which was more cult film style, and they asked me if I had any ideas that were maybe related to my field of research of neuroscience, and so Altered States is the one that really stood out for me.
And what is it about Altered States that made you want to introduce it and talk about it?
Well, in terms of cult films, it's such a wacky movie. I mean, it's, I guess, 37 years old or 36 years old now, so I don't even know if I need to do the spoiler alert, but spoiler alert just in case. It's William Hurt does a great job as being this psychiatrist, in the 1970s, early 80s, exploring like psychedelics and the mind and mind expansion and sensory deprivation.
Our atoms are 6 billion years old. We've got 6 billion years of memory in our minds.
Atoms are older than that.
Memory is energy. It doesn't disappear. It's still in there. There's a physiological pathway to our earlier consciousnesses. There has to be, and I'm telling you, it's in the goddamn limbic system.
Jesse, you're a wacko.
What's wacko about it, Mason? I'm a man in search of his true self. How archetypically American can you get? Everybody's looking for their true selves. We're all trying to fulfill ourselves. Understand ourselves, get in touch with ourselves, face the reality of ourselves, explore ourselves, expand ourselves. Ever since we dispensed with God, we've got nothing but ourselves to explain this meaningless horror of life.
You're a wacko.
Well, I think that true self, that original self, that first self is a real, mensurate, quantifiable thing, tangible and incarnate. And I'm going to find the fucker.
And you're like, okay, this is kind of an interesting film. It's talking about these fundamental aspects of what it is to be human. But then it goes in this really weird direction where he starts to devolve into this like primordial ape man and goes and runs amok. And like, it's just so like, it starts with such a great idea, but it turns so schlocky that it's just too funny to take seriously.
It wasn't a seizure. You saw the x-rays, Mason. There was clearly something anterior to the larynx that looked like a laryngeal sac. That's strictly simian. I obviously regressed to some quasi-simian creature.
I'm going to show these to someone who can read and write, because you're reading them wrong, that's all there is to it. Because no one's going to tell me you de-differentiated your goddamn genetic structure for 4 goddamn hours and then reconstituted.
Well, that's Ken Russell for you. I think He goes off on the deep end quite a lot.
Yeah, I'd first seen this movie in college and with a couple of friends, and you're sitting there and watching it and going, okay, all right, maybe this is a pretty good, and then you're just like, wait, what's going on right now? How... he's now energy beam ball. It's too funny.
The Nat says they want scientists to come and give a context for these films or possibly a new lens to look at them. So what kind of a context are you going to give to Altered States?
The context I'm going to give to the actual movie scientifically is what is the basis of like human perception and how we perceive the world around us, right? That's actually how the movie starts. It's talking about this guy as a researcher exploring sensory deprivation and what does that do to our perception. We know from a lot of experiments from the 70s, 80s, and so on that sensory deprivation, for people who don't know, these are warm water-filled tanks. The water is the temperature of the body, filled with salt solution, so you float instead of sinking. And you completely cut off from all light and all sound. And so if you put people in these tanks, supposedly, I've never done it, that cutoff from all of your external senses causes people to hallucinate pretty vividly, apparently, in some cases, very quickly, just after a few minutes of doing this. So once you cut off all external sensory input, your brain just starts to kind of make stuff up. And that's an interesting neuroscientific thing. Like, why does that happen? And it turns out this is something critical during development. Our brains have to do this in utero. So we have these things called retinal waves where the eyeballs, because they're not getting any input on light because they're in the womb, they self-stimulate the brain. So your eyeballs actually stimulate the rest of the brain so the brain can develop normally. And so this is, there's real science behind the wacky pretext of the movie.
From this real science, it spins a bit out of control. So is there anything beyond kind of what they start with in the sensory deprivation tank? Is there anything else in the film that kind of touches on real science?
Well, yeah. So in the movie, William Hurt's character ends up going to Central or South America and sort of exploring psychedelics, and then starts taking the psychedelics in the sensory deprivation chamber, which is what causes him to become an ape man or primordial ooze eventually, which I guess maybe I need to do the scientific disclaimer here, which is that does not happen. But the combination thereof, that's where it starts to spin out of control, right? But of course, psychedelics are a real thing, and that's something that people do. And actually, what's really interesting is that there's a number of researchers in the UK that are actually studying the role that psychedelic. Specifically, I think they were looking at psilocybin, which is the active ingredient in magic mushrooms, in post-traumatic stress disorder and anxiety and depression, and finding surprisingly very positive, strong outcomes for patients that are suffering from these disorders. So there's actual modern current research going on in this domain, which is stuff that's been banned for a very long time, partly because of these kinds of what's going on in these kinds of movies, right? This was the perception that the mainstream had for a very long time, which is the Timothy Leary era, 1970s, turn on, tune in, drop out, something like that?
Yes.
What's the exact phrase? Anyway, right? So it was these legitimate researchers in the 1960s and 70s. Timothy Leary was a psychologist at Harvard, but they took this stuff a little bit too far and became kind of a cult thing almost in some ways, right? And so that really harmed the ability for legitimate researchers to be studying the effects of these kinds of drugs, right? Which is kind of amazing when you think about something like, marijuana, which is now legal in California, at least in small doses, was federally still a Schedule I drug, which is not something, it's incredibly... There's a very large amount of people that have been jailed for these kinds of things, right? And it's harmed the ability to actually research for scientists what do these things do, right? Because they do alter our perceptions briefly. There's a lot of neuroscientists that find that stuff kind of fascinating, right? It's not my field of study. It's not something I work with, but there's legitimate research questions here.
Just how dangerous is this stuff he brought back from Mexico?
No, I didn't say dangerous. They said it was weird. It hangs around too long. And what's really screwy is it heads straight to the brain.
Well, I don't believe this. You guys are shooting up with an untested drug that stacks up in the brain and works in the nucleus of the cell, and you don't call that dangerous.
For the record, we don't actually shoot up. Eddie drinks.
Well, it's going to stop right now. You guys are supposed to be reputable scientists, for God's sake, not two kids in the door freaking out on Mexican mushrooms.
Well, why do you think I called you for? Let's see you stop him.
And so that's one of the things I feel like might be worth touching on this weekend, talking about this movie, which is how is it that the perception of our own perception, right? Like the cultural perception of the way that drugs are viewed and how they change the way that we see the world briefly while under the influence of these drugs. Why is that something that is so, I don't know, it's like stigmatized and, makes people uncomfortable, and it's, partly it's legal issues and partly it's this perception of movies where if I take enough drugs, then I'm going to turn crazy ape person. I don't know, right? So there's a strange overlap here between the cultural perceptions and the actual science. And they're wildly different in some cases.
So you're not only giving kind of the scientific context to put it in terms of what's the good science or bad science or the real REEL science versus the real science, but you also are kind of going to let people put it into a context of how science is allowed to proceed under certain legal restrictions.
Yeah, I think this is really important as a scientist to consider, right? Which is we're living in a world where things are advancing very quickly, technologically, biomedical, here in San Diego, biomedical sciences reign king. There's a lot of advancements happening very quickly. And, looking back historically at what was going on with the rise of the research in psychedelics in the 1960s by legitimate scientists, and then how that got a little bit out of hand because of potentially unethical uses by the researchers, shut down the research for the next 30 years. And so we can use that historical context and say, okay, well, that's kind of a funny era in scientific history, and it's led to a lot of very strange perceptions. What sorts of things are happening now? Can we try and, as scientists, consider what are the ethical implications and what are the long-term implications for the research, and be proactive instead of reactive, and say what's going on right now in research and what lessons can we take from the past to make sure that we don't miss positive opportunities for healthcare and palliative care and things like that.
You said that this particular film doesn't cross over into your particular field of neuroscience. So what kind of research is it that you are doing here?
In my lab here at UCSD, we focus mostly on, very broadly, how does the brain talk to itself? Our brains have 86 billion neurons in them. These neurons are the fundamental units, the cells that make us think. And we have at least as many other cell types in our brain, maybe 10 times more. So we have potentially 1 trillion or so of these cells in our brains that are doing that are sending these little electrical signals to each other that help us, make us think, cause us to perceive the world around us. And so my lab focuses on how do they coordinate the information that they have to transfer to each other. So if I'm sitting here talking to you right now, I'm looking at you, light's bouncing off of you into my retina, that signal goes back to my brain, it takes 72 milliseconds or so to get there, and then that signal from the brain moves all over the rest of my brain to all these different parts, out to my spinal cord to allow me to move my hands. I'm sort of gesticulating here as I'm talking to you. I'm Italian, I can't help it. And all of these things are happening simultaneously, and these are all because of our neurons talking to each other. And so my lab does a mix of working with computational models, so we simulate in computers how neurons might talk, and we also work with people in a variety of different scenarios. So we have undergraduates come into the lab and we do brain imaging on them. And we also work with people undergoing brain surgery here at UCSD for epilepsy. And these people, as part of the standard treatment, they get these electrodes implanted into their brains for up to 2 weeks. So the surgeons can identify where the seizures, which are what causes the epilepsy, are coming from in their brain. And while they've got these electrodes implanted in their brain, we ask them if they'd like to do our memory and attention studies. And usually they're very happy because they're quite bored sitting there watching TV, waiting to have seizures. That gives us an incredible window and insight into human brain activity that we can't get using any other kind of like non-invasive brain imaging like EEG or MRI. And we try and test our theories that come out of the models.
Now, you've spoken at events that I've done before, and one of the things you mentioned are you have kind of these, I don't know if they're games or exercises where when you explain them, it was you talked about some things where I'm going like, how can the brain like make mistakes or be tricked like that? I don't know if you remember, one of them had to do with if you have somebody talking to someone, you can actually switch the person and they might not notice.
Oh, yeah. There's a lot of strange perceptual tricks that our brains sort of play on ourselves. I think what you're alluding to is something called change blindness is sort of one way of putting it. And this is something actually that is fascinating because stage magicians take advantage of this kind of stuff. There's actually a famous couple of papers published by a group of neuroscientists in collaboration with Teller from Penn and Teller, and a group of other stage magicians, where these neuroscientists work with these stage magicians and say, how do you know how to trick people so well? How do you know how to distract them? Because these stage magicians have this incredible intuition for how human perception works. This change blindness is very specifically, you can have a scene in a room, for example, or you can even have somebody talking to a person, and then disrupt that somehow. So in the classic example is you have a barrier then placed between the two people that were talking. So you can do this on the street where you have a stranger come up to a person, start talking to them, and then have a group of people. I think in the video that I'm thinking about and that I show, they have two people walking, and they've got like a door or something that they're carrying between them, so it acts as a barrier between the two people. And while that door is moving between the two people, one of the people is swapped, one of the speakers. And so now it's a totally different person talking to the person on the street, and the person on the street doesn't even notice like half the time that the person is totally different. And these kinds of perceptual tricks happen all the time. And the way that this works is a lot of what we experience in the world isn't just the raw inputs coming in. So it's not just the like photons bouncing off of you into my retina. A lot of the way that we perceive the world is actually built by the brain itself. So our brain actually fills in information where we may not have it. So the brain sort of does this, like, here's what I'm expecting to see, and that's what you perceive. And this is stuff that's come out of decades of research in psychology and neuroscience, and in my department here, cognitive science. It's pretty amazing and remarkable. We don't normally notice on a day-to-day basis. It's not really that important, but because of these little tricks of the way, quirks, I should say, of the way that the brain works, people can take advantage of that, and very strange perceptual things happen like that.
Now, you're talking about all these trillions of neurons going on in your brain. So does it irk you in certain movies where they talk about how much we use the brain?
Yeah. Okay. So the two that come to my mind, the recent ones that touch on this, are Limitless and Lucy.
It is estimated most human beings only use 10% of their brain's capacity. Imagine if we could access 100%. Interesting things begin to happen. Yes?
Professor Norman, my name's Lucy. I just read all your research on the human brain. It's a little rudimentary, but you're on the right track.
Both of those movies they start with that myth of we only use 10% of our brains, and if we could unlock the other 90% of our brains, the potential would be limitless, which is the title of the movie.
You know how they say that we can only access 20% of our brain? This lets you access all of it. They've had clinical trials and it's FDA approved.
All right, just out of curiosity, and that's all. I was blind, but now I see. A tablet a day, and I was limitless.
And it's not true. I guarantee you we use 100% of our brains. We don't use 100% of our brains all the time, but we use every part of our brain. Our brains are very expensive from a energy standpoint for the body. So the example, the stat I like to give is our brains are only about 3% of our overall body weight, but they get 20% of the output from the heart. So when the blood is pumping out of the heart, it's sending oxygen and sugar and all of this stuff around the body, and the brain uses about 20% of that, even though it's only 3% of the overall body size. And so it's very, very expensive. Our brains require a lot of energy to keep us going. And if we only use 10% of them, what's the other 90% doing? Just sitting there taking up oxygen and sugar and that kind of stuff that doesn't need. The more trite way I like to give is, if you really believe we only use 10% of our brains, then, would you let me take out 90% that we're not using? Would you feel like that would be okay? Of course not, right? And so that sort of irks me, but I guess I have a number of friends that studied film or are in the film industry. There's like a fundamental buy or a conceit that every movie gets, right? And you get one crazy, wacky thing. Any movie can have one crazy, wacky thing, right? The Matrix, the conceit is that we're all living in a simulated reality. Okay, fine. We can accept that. You know, in Harry Potter, it's magic exists, right? And in Limitless, it's we only use 10% of our brains. So as a scientist, I might kind of roll my eyes at that, but I say, okay, you get the one wacky, not true thing. And that's all any movie gets, though. If you try and do too much, if you try and ask people to then believe, oh, you know, like if Harry Potter, okay, there's magic, but it turns out everybody's living in a simulated reality. You'd be like, what? That doesn't, why do you have magic and then everybody's living in the simulated world? That makes no sense whatsoever. So it's okay. I can divorce that overly analytical part of my brain and still enjoy watching Bradley Cooper run around and kick some butts.
I now had cultural appetites.
Since when do you speak Italian?
I finished my book in 4 days.
I'd like to renegotiate my advance.
Math became useful.
From 12,000 to 2.3 million in 10 days.
I'm baffled by this guy. So, Eddie Mora, you do know you're a freak. What's your secret?
Medication.
Since that 10% notion comes up a couple of times, is there any basis for that, or where do you think that, is there a place where that came from at some point?
That's a particularly pervasive myth, and it pretty much every neuroscientist gets frustrated with it. And there's been a lot of people who've tried to track down where does this idea come from. And we actually aren't really sure. Us scientists, we don't exactly know. So there's a couple of ideas. One is when brain imaging when it was invented and it became very media friendly. So, you know, there was this period in the, I guess, mid to late 90s, early 2000s where fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging, was this dominant method in our field because it allowed us to image brain activity non-invasively. So suddenly we didn't have to have work with these patients undergoing brain surgery. We could stick anybody in this brain scanner and study their brain activity. The images that come out of that are these statistical maps of when we have somebody lying in a brain scanner thinking about thing X versus thing Y, here are the parts of the brain that are more active when they're thinking about X over Y, right? So you can have somebody lying in a scanner and say, you know, here are some pictures of faces, and here are some pictures of houses. What parts of the brain are more active when you look at faces versus houses? And it's very small parts of the brain that specialize in these different things. And so the images that come out of that show this whole brain picture, and then this tiny little spot of activity. And so that's one place we think that may have come out, is just because the pictures that people were seeing in the media from these scientific results were just these tiny little pieces of the brain that were active. But you know, it may only be a tiny little piece of the brain that's active for faces, and another part that's active for houses, and another part that does language, and another part that does vision, and another part that does, you know, abstract thinking. And when you add those all up, you get 100% of the brain, right? But any one little piece is only tiny. So that's probably where it comes from, but not 100% certain.
So are there any Hollywood films that kind of, if they don't get science right, where you feel that they're depicting science in a way that you think is accurate on some level, either in terms of the process or just how it depicts that world? Okay, so science in general, yes. There are some that get it pretty good. Neuroscience, there are fewer that get the brain science side of things right. And maybe it's just because how many Hollywood directors and screenwriters are friends with neuroscientists, right? Like if you don't know, it's like if you ask me as a neuroscientist to try and direct a movie, I'd have no idea what to do, right? Like I would still use the little clacker board and have say action, and that's basically the limit of my knowledge, right? But that said, there are some that get the science, the brain science, less wrong than others. To be totally honest, like what got me into the field were a couple of sci-fi movies and comic books and things like that. But specifically in 1999, when The Matrix came out, Keanu Reeves is laying there and he gets uploaded kung fu to his brain, right? And I was like, wow, is that even a thing that would be possible? This is, I'm an undergrad at the time, I don't know, like a freshman or a sophomore. Wow, is that even possible? I've never even thought about that. And you start to read about this stuff and you're like, okay, well, no, it's not really possible, but theoretically, could it be? And if so, how do we get there, right? So The Matrix is pretty off the wall, right? But the idea that you can, in fact, inject ideas or thoughts or perceptions into people isn't totally crazy.
Now, I'm supposed to start with these operation programs first. That's Major Barton Shed. Let's do something a little more fun. How about combat training?
Jiu-jitsu? I'm going to learn jiu-jitsu.
Holy shit. Hey, Mikey, I think he likes it. How about some more?
Hell yes.
It's not something that we could do anytime soon, but it's theoretically something that's possible, right? Inception is another, I'm just thinking about what are the current movies that have come out talking about these kinds of things. Inception is another one where you're like, okay, well, how are they all sharing a dream? What does that even mean? That doesn't really make any sense. So those are examples of, kind of. But then there are other ones that, maybe like Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, a little bit more of not a blockbuster film, obviously, but the idea is, can you erase memories?
Here at Lacuna, we have a safe technique for the focused erasure of troubling memories.
Is there any risk of brain damage?
Technically, the procedure is brain damage, but it's on a par with a night of heavy drinking, nothing you'll miss.
Right? Can you erase unpleasant memories? And so far, the answer is no, we can't just go in and selectively erase any kind of memory. In fact, as neuroscientists, we don't really know where memories are in the brain. We've never found a memory. We know parts of the brain that are required for you to form memories, but we can't find specific memories. That said, there's a group of researchers out at MIT and Harvard that are doing a decent job of eradicating fear type memories in rats, for example, but it's not something we're going to be able to do in humans because it requires you to genetically modify the rats in the first place. So there are things that are theoretically possible, just so far out there that it's, if ever possible, it will be a very, very long way away.
Is it interesting in some respects that films that maybe aren't necessarily realistic in how they depict science are sometimes the films that may inspire people the most? Because like you're talking about The Matrix, maybe that's not a real thing, but as someone who's just starting to get into science, it's something that just sparks imagination and says like, oh, maybe let me look at this.
Yeah, I'm a big advocate of science fiction. There were some really early in my life, comic books and science fiction really sparked my interest in science, like proper science. And so in conjunction to reading all these comic books and looking at, and sci-fi books and things like that, I then was interested in knowing what is the actual science, right? And so my family would give me these actual science books also. I think science fiction, actually, it's not even I think, demonstrably science fiction has played a very important role in advancing science in our society. From something as trivial as in The Next Generation, Star Trek The Next Generation, the set designer created these little touchpad things that everybody used. This is the late 80s. The Next Generation came out, 87, I think. And it was this cheap way for them to design a set where they had these modular computers that had these screens that the buttons could change. And that directly inspired the Apple iPad. And so that's one example out of many, right? A lot of scientists I know, they got inspired by reading science fiction as kids. In the 1940s and 50s, you had these penny novels that were all about traveling to space and things like that. And then you look at the huge boom of NASA post-Kennedy in the 1960s leading up to the landing on the moon, and all these nerdy kids that were reading these books in the 1940s and 50s became the rocket scientists at NASA in the 1960s and 70s. And so you have this direct connection. That said, I know for a fact a number of science fiction authors are having a hard time writing science that's far enough out there because science proper now is advancing so quickly, right? I think the most famous case is William Gibson, who wrote Neuromancer and all these classic science fiction books. A giant in the science fiction field has said that he's just given up on writing science fiction because real science is too weird now for him to envision what might be in 100 years from now, for example.
Well, you mentioned that a lot of films don't seem to get the neuroscience right, that they're a little bit out there. Is that possibly because this notion of the brain and what it's capable of is something that really spins the imagination of these filmmakers so that they do leap beyond whatever the real science is to try and, get to something that's more fantastical?
Yeah, that's a good point. I'm trying to think about what is the equivalent of, I don't know, like a transporter from Star Trek, but for the brain, right? Like, so you have this crazy idea, like, what if we could just teleport people from one place to another? Or what if we can travel faster than light? Or, any of these other number of science fiction conceits. But how do you apply that then to biology? What's the equivalent of, faster than light speed, but for the brain? And what you end up getting are crazy things like, if we were so far advanced, maybe we'd be, again, this is a Star Trek trope, like beings of pure energy or thought, right? Okay, well, what does that even mean, right? And so I think it's hard because we don't have a good intuition for how our own brains work, right? And the phrase that we like to use in the field is like, we're trying to use the very thing that we don't understand to understand the thing we're trying to figure out, right? We're trying to use our brains to figure out our brains. And that's kind of hard, right? How do you reverse engineer a brain, right? It's like, imagine giving a caveman a laptop, right? And say, here you go, figure it out. Right? They don't know anything about transistors or binary or computer code or any of this kind of stuff, right? How are you supposed to reverse engineer that thing? Especially when you're not allowed to open it. We can't just crack open a skull and look in the brain and sort of poke around and see how these things work, right? We can't. So how do we, without being able to actually look at the thing directly, figure out how it works? And it's just incredibly difficult, and it leads to a lot of strange. We have folk beliefs, right? Like these mythologies of how the brain works.
So are there any films, science fiction or science related, that actually inspired you in very specific ways?
Yeah, so there's science fiction and more science fact, right? So I already talked about The Matrix. Got me thinking about, well, what is memory? Can you upload thoughts to people, right? I mean, essentially that's what I'm doing when I'm reading a book, just very slow, right? Like somebody had ideas, they put it on a page in this like really weird little scratching marks, and then 1,000 years later I pick up the book that somebody else wrote that's long dead, and now I have new thoughts because of it. So it's kind of, in a sense, right? It's just a slower version of The Matrix. And that's remarkable when you think about it, because there isn't really a difference other than the propagation time that it takes and the method that it's being used. Awakenings, though. So Robin Williams is playing this physician who gives these patients this drug, and they wake up for the first time in decades. The film is inspired by a book with the same name by an actual physician named Oliver Sacks, who passed away about a year or two ago. And Oliver Sacks wrote a number of books talking about his experience with his patients. He was a neurologist, so he was an actual medical doctor that worked with all of these interesting patients over his career. And he has that book. And then the other one that got me into the field was An Anthropologist on Mars and The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. Each chapter in these books is essentially a case study of his experience with a patient that had a very rare or interesting neurological disorder. The title of The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat is from a patient of his who lost the ability to recognize faces. There's a specific part of the brain that allows us to perceive faces, and if that somehow gets damaged, we can no longer recognize individuals by their faces. They have to learn tricks on, how to identify people based upon smell or the way that they walk, the way their voices sound, things like that. Just having read those and knowing, wow, that's a real thing, was also pretty transformative in my scientific sort of career. Because I'd started initially as an undergraduate studying physics, and I moved over into the biology and neuroscience side of things later in my undergrad.
I also understand that a far less serious film also inspired you a bit, Real Genius.
Yeah, I liked Real Genius. Real Genius was a funny movie. So again, late 80s, right? So I'm sort of very absolutely dating myself as to when I grew up. Val Kilmer played this sort of wacky, smart undergrad.
I want you to meet Chris Knight.
Why is that toy on your head?
Because if I wear it anywhere else, it chafes. I'm sorry. It's just that I didn't want you guys to think I was stuffy, no fun. All brain, no penis.
Pardon me?
I'm sorry. It's just an infantile response to authority.
Yes, you are Chris Knight, aren't you?
I hope so. I'm wearing his underwear.
So Val Kilmer plays this wunderkind, brilliant guy who then later on in college decides that maybe working isn't everything, and he just he's sort of like goofy, free-spirited, wacky, prank-playing sort of guy. And I really liked that as a kid, the idea that you could be really, really smart and also totally goofy. And so a lot of people actually, because of that, thought that I would like something like Richard Feynman. who's, very famous Nobel Prize winning physicist and also famous for being like this bongo playing, pot smoking sort of funny dude. And so I got a lot of his books from family and friends growing up, but then you read him and you're kind of like, wow, that guy's not a playful, pranky guy. He's kind of a jerk sometimes. Like, he's just mean. But there's sort of that, I like that, right? There's something about science that is inherently playful, right? Like, I come into lab and yes, like, it's very serious. We're really trying to figure out ultimately how does the brain work so we can try and help people with debilitating diseases. If I focus on that, it kind of becomes like more dour. But the whole act of science is discovery, right? The whole act of science is trying new things and seeing what works and what doesn't. And that's a fun process. That's more like, that's playing, right? And so in general, I try and approach the science as more from that perspective of, yes, there is a real goal that has a serious implication, but the process doesn't have to be all hyper serious. The process should be fun.
Also, is there something about Val Kilmer's character who is also very rebellious and kind of anti-establishment that kind of reflects what, because in a certain respect, scientists have to be thinking outside the box and kind of maybe pushing the boundaries of certain accepted principles. So is that kind of sense of rebellion also something that maybe attracted you?
Oh, probably as a kid, I'm sure, right? Like, I was really worried. So my friend and I had written this goofy book about the zombie brain, which is how you and I met. The whole idea was, can we teach neuroscience, serious neuroscience, using something completely and totally silly like zombies, right? And a lot of our colleagues said, maybe you shouldn't publish this book until after you have tenure. Because, you're looking and you're like, what is that? Why would a serious scientist write a book about zombie brains? But it was a fun process. Like, it actually made my teaching better by sitting down and saying, how can we teach something inherently complex and confusing and messy like the brain, and using this pop culture sort of idea? It teaches you, me, us as scientists, how to better explain things. It's really, really easy to get caught up in like these jargon-laden terms of, if we had this conversation about, you asked me what is my research, then I could say, what is the role that neural oscillations play in coordinating information transfer between brain regions? We study the balance of excitation and inhibition, and I could talk about it in the technical sense, but that doesn't make any sense to you or anybody listening. And so the idea is, can you distill down this complexity into something more concrete and understandable? And the process of doing that is itself eye-opening. And so, if I talk to my kids, my 5-year-old, and he asks me what I do, he knows I'm a scientist. But if I then try and explain it and he says, what does that mean? What does that mean? What does that mean? That very act of explaining something that, I might think I understand, it's a jargon term that everybody in the field uses, but I'm like, wait a minute, what does that actually mean? What do we mean when we say that? How might that happen? Sometimes some of the most interesting questions are buried in things that we think we understand, but we really don't. And so the act of trying to communicate these things and being a little bit goofier and weirder in that sense I genuinely think has made my science better.
Well, and your book is Do Zombies Dream of Undead Sheep? Fortunately, I had a chance to read it, and it's fabulous. And not only does it use zombies to kind of explain things in neuroscience, but you also give this really nice kind of back history to the science itself and where it came from, which I had no idea about this person who worked with gladiators.
Right, yeah. So that's Galen, was a physician in ancient Rome. I mean, this is 2,000 years ago, and he worked with gladiators. And the Roman gladiatorial combatees were people who tended to get a large number of spinal cord and head injuries. He documented what kinds of injuries led to what kinds of disorders. And so that was a very early example of connecting human thinking and behavior and movement to the brain itself. And yeah, the history of medicine and neuroscience in general is fascinating to me, right? A lot of what we know in medicine and a lot of what we know in brain science comes from these unfortunate historical cases where something has gone tremendously wrong, right? Another example we give in the book is one of the first ways we started to understand how does the brain process visual information came about because of the way that helmets were designed in World War I. He had these little like bowl-shaped helmets that just kind of sat on the top of the head, but it like left the like back of the head exposed, and the back of the brain there, right at the back of the head, is where the visual parts of the brain sit. And so these soldiers were surviving shrapnel injuries, but they were getting this little visual part of their brain damaged. And early physicians started noting that when shrapnel hit like this little part versus a part like a centimeter over versus another 1 centimeter up, different parts of the visual field would be lost. So they'd be blind only in one little tiny spot. And that allowed this physician to map out how our visual world is mapped onto the brain because of this design of these helmets in World War I. Right? And so I think looking historically also and say, where do our ideas come from is also really important in science. Not just what do we know as being true or not true or probably not true, but also how did we get there? How did we get that idea in the first place? Where does it come from? Is also, I think, something that's incredibly important to understand.
Now, aside from the films we've already discussed, are there any films or TV shows or something that you would recommend to people to say, like, here's something that depicts science in an interesting way, or here's something that maybe you can show your kids that might inspire them?
I don't know about showing the kids. Okay, so I'll separate those, right? So there's a lot of really interesting shows going on right now about that are neuroscience related, right? Like what does it mean to be a person? What does it mean to think and perceive and all this kind of stuff, right? So you can have something like, a little bit older now, I guess a decade older, but like Battlestar Galactica, right? The remake was all about like, what is humanness? And then you have, but more modern, you've got Westworld, which is a big one about like, what does it mean to be a person? What is it? Same kind of idea, right? Playing around with similar ideas. Black Mirror, which is, more technologically focused of like, what if we push this idea of the ubiquity of smart devices or cell phones or something like to the very, very future, like what are the possible outcomes, right? So there's a lot of really excellent science fiction out there right now. In terms of stuff more for maybe kids, I'm trying to think of like, what do I watch with my kids? I actually play a lot of games with my kids, board games and a couple of video games. There's a lot of really great games out there for kids, though, to get them sort of more engaged with science and engineering and math. Lego is always a good one. The actual difficulty of building a Lego set properly, you're looking at the instructions and you have to then translate this 2D image into a 3D structure that you're building with your hands, I think is amazing, right? It really teaches a fundamental engineering skill for kids. Connects is also kind of similar to Lego. Then of course there's just like plain old normal video games that my son likes to play, Mario, everything. What are some really good cartoons? There's so many good science shows for kids, right? Like growing up, I watched Bill Nye the Science Guy, and now he's coming out with a new series he announced, I think yesterday or a couple of days ago. I don't think it's going to be kid-oriented though, like Bill Nye the Science Guy was, but Mythbusters was another great one. So there's a lot of really fun stuff for maybe not kids as young as mine. I have a 2-year-old and a 5-year-old. But for, preteens and teenagers, there's so much great stuff out there that even the science fiction and comic book stuff is still like, I feel like it's more rooted in the real science now than science fiction in the 1980s was. You look at something like The Avengers, which is all over the place right now. And Iron Man's got his suit and he has this little AI Jarvis thing that becomes Vision. But none of those things are too crazy. It's not too far out there, right? And I actually use Iron Man when I give some public lectures as an example because like the original Iron Man published in the 1960s was really just a guy in a heavy suit and it had air conditioning. And like, they were like, I forget the original suit design, what kinds of stuff, right? Like that was the 1960s, this was a superhero, a guy in a very heavy suit that had air conditioning to keep him cool, that also had some hydraulics to allow him to lift heavy stuff. Now you look at the Iron Man suit in the modern comics and it's like this nanotechnology, it swims around in his bloodstream. He doesn't actually ever put on a suit. It's controlled by his brain, so it's hooked up to his spinal cord and he thinks about the suit coming on and then these like little nanobots that are living inside of him form this shell around him that is the Iron Man suit now. And you're like, what? Like, again, that's not something we can do, but it's also grounded in like real-ish science, right? But it's very different than a guy wearing a heavy suit with air conditioning, right? And it's neat that they try and at least put this veneer of science fact around it. You look at something like, again, I grew up on Star Trek: The Next Generation, and the screenwriters had this phrase called teching the tech. They just, when the screenwriters were trying to write an episode where they needed some technobabble, which is what they called it, inserted into a scene, they would just write tech the tech and they would have people just write in smart sounding physics and science words without any care about whether it was plausible or realistic in any way whatsoever. Whereas now you have like the National Academy of Sciences has this program called the Science and Entertainment Exchange, which is screenwriters and authors and novelists can contact the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, and they can be put in touch with real scientists who can act as advisors to try and make sure that the science is somewhat realistic that they're representing. And I think that's amazing, that you have this really beautiful blend of science fact and science fiction.
After you introduce this film, Altered States, on Saturday, what do you hope audiences might take away different than if they just went into that film cold without having anything set up for them? Do you hope they come out of it maybe questioning science in films more, or just thinking about science when they see films like this?
Yeah, so whenever I do something like this, my goal is to always try and get people to appreciate how the beauty and the complexity of the real thing, right? So you can very easily make a movie that is trying to play up some amazing, wonderful, complex thing, right? And what Altered States is trying to do is trying to get, is trying to get people to think about, again, what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be limited by our perception, right? The only way we can interact with the world is through our senses, right? And that's a kind of neat idea. But the reality behind that is also incredibly beautiful and amazing, right? And so it doesn't have to just be a pretend thing that you can get people to think about. It's like a real thing that if you actually think about the reality of who we are and how the brains work, that's in almost some ways more amazing because it's real. It's not fake. You don't have to make anything up. And that's usually the thing I try and get people to appreciate. And that's supposed to be a good thing.
Well, and I also get the feeling, even though I think all four of the scientists are going to kind of point out the things that these films have gotten wrong or maybe aren't genuine science, I think all of you guys really love these movies despite potential flaws in their science.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's unfair as a scientist 35 years later to try and hold a movie that is 35 years old to a modern scientific view, right? Like it's not a fair thing, right? So I can look back at it and say, well, that's kind of a goofy thing that they're doing, but it's not. I don't want to make fun of it. It really is. It's a loving sort of playful jibe, right? It's meant to be yes, okay, they got the science wrong, but isn't it interesting what they were trying to do? You can appreciate it for that, I think.
All right. Well, I want to thank you very much. It's always fun to talk to you, especially I really like talking to you about zombies, so we'll have to get together again once and just do a complete zombie show. But thanks a lot, and I look forward to your talk. And I'm going to make you a Jell-O brain so you can dissect it.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I love doing the brain dissection, Jell-O brain dissection. All right, anyway, thanks, Beth.
All right, thank
Good to see you.
And now for the last scientist I'll be speaking to about the Real Science program, Adam Haberman. So how did you get involved in this, and tell me which film you picked?
I actually just responded to an email. A colleague of mine was asking around if anyone was interested. I couldn't say no. We went back and forth for a little while, but ultimately we went with Weird Science. Good excuse to see it again. And it's a good excuse to talk about sort of things that are happening in genetics, and designer babies, and other things we're doing is trying to learn about the genetics of interesting human traits.
The Nat says that they're going to have these scientists present the films and give them a context or a new lens in which to view them. So I'm sure everybody's dying to find out. So is there science that will allow teenage boys to create the perfect girl in their bedrooms?
Not with the Commodore 64. No, I think they still need better equipment than that. I mean, there is certainly science to try to predict traits, or if we're trying to edit DNA to try to make the traits that we want. And there is some really interesting stuff happening with 3D printing and even with living materials. So if you put those together, maybe you could do something sometime in the future.
So what kind of lens do you want to give people to look at this film? Because this film was from the 1980s, John Hughes comedy. What would you like them to go into it this time and maybe watch it with a different set of eyes?
The idea, which they play with in the movie, the idea of what would be your perfect person.
Okay, now what?
Should we give her a brain?
Yeah, we can play chess with her.
Chess? Just give her a brain, okay?
Right, and they feed in a bunch of centerfolds and whatever else. But, you know, since we know more about what controls our traits, you know, what do we think about being a perfect person? You know, we can be lucky and they can, you know, have a computer that realizes that you may put in the picture of a centerfold, but what you need is someone to push you a little further and, you know, get you out of your shell. But I don't trust computers to know that for me. So, you know, we can think about what do you really want in that perfect person.
The Nat said they are also getting scientists whose field kind of lines up with the films in some way. So what is your actual field of study, and what is the kind of research and work that you do here at USD?
So I do research in genetics and cell biology. I use fruit flies, so I'm not creating any people. We're trying to study neurons, which are really good at staying healthy. You know, we have nerve cells in our bodies that were present when we were born and those same cells will be with us all through our lives, which isn't true for most other kinds of cells. So trying to understand how nerve cells are a little bit different so that they live so long, and then hopefully that will help us understand how it goes wrong in diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. So I use a genetics and cell biology approach, and then I'm teaching courses in genetics and cell biology, and I've been talking a lot about these kinds of genetics in class over the last month.
Do you find films like Weird Science, even as ridiculous as it may be, do you find it as a good tool in some way, as kind of a gateway to either find a new way to talk about something that's real science, or to find a way to get to maybe younger kids who maybe are scared of science or not that interested in it?
I think so. Any avenue to get someone to ask a question or wonder what's possible, I think is a good way to start a conversation. Even CSI shows, which I have a love-hate relationship with. I tried for a long time, you know, and like either the science is good or the story is good, but I could never find an episode where I liked both. But still, it makes people wonder what is possible and how the things work. And so it's a good place to start. And people who are really interested will follow along from that to wherever we need to go.
Are there any films that depict science, your field in particular, or just science in general or scientists, in a way that really irks you, that it just makes you insane to go and see those films?
Most of them, I think. The ones that treat scientists well are few and far between. So E.T. was one that always bothered me. The scientists are the bad guys. You don't get to see their faces except for one of them. They just run around taking aliens. Another one that really bothered me as much as I wanted to like it was Twister.
There is a mystery. Elusive. Unpredictable. Violent. It terrifies most scientists. But for a new breed, the challenge is saving lives. The research is deadly. The laboratory is nature itself.
But yeah, most of the time, a scientist doesn't seem like a scientist to me. It's rare to actually get a movie where someone is intelligent and thoughtful and not just a robot. And so those movies are actually a lot of fun.
So what is the quality of a scientist that you think is key to kind of that kind of role and a film that maybe gets that right?
Well, Contact was a movie that did well in getting that right, I think, where you have this foundation of knowledge, but you don't just know everything. You just know enough to know how to ask the next question.
I can't prove it. I can't even explain it. But everything that I know as a human being, everything that I am tells me that it was real. I was given something wonderful, something that changed me forever. A vision of the universe that tells us undeniably how tiny and insignificant and how rare and precious we all are. A vision that tells us that we belong to something that is greater than ourselves, that we are not, that none of us are alone.
And then you ask a question and try to get an answer, and there's a story there. So the movies that I think get that right are kind of procedurals. They're following a story, and you get the excitement and the drama of what's going on. I was trying to think back this morning. Another one that came up was Lorenzo's Oil from back in the early 90s, which I think was a pretty heavy movie, but showed parents of a child with a rare disease who learned the science and came up with their own theory for how to treat the disease and turned out to be right. That person wasn't even a scientist, but it showed the scientists as they weren't villains either. They were people who were trying to do what they thought was best based on what they knew. And so, it's fair in that sense. We're not know-it-alls and trying to tell everyone what to do. We're trying to learn new, interesting stuff.
Are there any films that may not be depicting genetics in the most accurate light, but that you feel are fun films and kind of spark people's imaginations about what the field can be about?
Well, Gattaca's a good one that way for sure. It gets heavy too, but yeah, I would love to be able to take a hair from someone's brush, take it to a counter, and get their DNA sequence 5 seconds later. That stuck with me. But yeah, I think it really gets to the idea of we can learn a lot about who we are and what we can do from genetics, but how much can we really learn? And, that movie overstated, in my opinion, how much genetics controls us, but it certainly brings up the questions in a really interesting way.
Genetics, what can it mean? The ability to perfect the physical and mental characteristics of every unborn child.
Of genetic engineering. To choose the genes. In the sense of society.
In the not-too-distant future, our DNA will determine everything about us. A minute drop of blood, saliva, or a single hair determines where you can work, who you should marry, what you're capable of achieving. In a society where success is determined by science, divided by the standards of perfection.
And Jurassic Park's also a good one to start conversations. And now that they just found a dinosaur feather in amber, it sort of brought it back to mind. Because, we had lots of bones, but no one knew what they were covered with because all that stuff broke down. But yeah, it's where we can take a sequence and try to recreate an organism, which, theoretically we could try to do, although maybe not quite as easy as it is in the movie. But yeah, again, it's fun ideas to play with.
This fossilized tree sap, which we call amber, waited for millions of years with the mosquito inside until Jurassic Park scientists came along. Using sophisticated techniques, they extract the preserved blood from the mosquito and, bingo, dino DNA. Now that's where our geneticists take over. Thinking machine supercomputers and gene sequencers break down the strand in minutes. And virtual reality displays show our geneticists the gaps in the DNA sequence. We use the complete DNA of a frog to fill in the holes and complete the code. And now we can make a baby dinosaur.
Almost any Michael Crichton story in the first 20 minutes is really, it's a good seed of something, and then it gets on amphetamines and goes from there. But
so when you were growing up, were you interested in science fiction films? And do you remember any that kind of sparked something in you that made you more interested in science?
I mean, I liked science fiction and fantasy and lots of generally nerdy stuff. There wasn't as much as there is now. I think that the things that actually moved me a little bit more, I think of them as scientist fiction, where it's a story about a scientist or some group of smart kids or something. So Real Genius was the big one for me. I absolutely loved that movie. And that was not so much about the science. They're trying to make a laser and then they realize it's being used for a weapon. But it's more about smart kids being smart and trying to do something, and then how do they navigate the rest of their lives, and what social norms do they care about, and their competence can sort of compensate for other things they don't want to do. And so that one that was neat to me. And the first person I actually remember wanting to be was Hawkeye Pierce from the TV show MASH. I hadn't seen the movie, which might have changed things. I don't know. Again, this was a smart guy who was really good at what he did and did what he thought was right, whether or not other people agreed with it. For a long time, I thought, yeah, that's how I want to live my life, though hopefully not in a war zone.
Well, it seems like both Val Kilmer, who was in Real Science, and Hawkeye Pierce character from MASH, they do have this rebelliousness in them. Is that something that you feel either you admire or that you think is a good thing in a scientist? Do you feel like scientists need to be kind of like pushing at established rules and order in order to kind of advance?
Yeah, to a point. You have to ask questions, and you have to believe the answers you find when you ask those questions. And that may take you to a place where you disagree with the established ideas. And yeah, you can't back down from that. You should follow your experiments where they go. So I've seen people who want to do uncontroversial stuff, science only, and just sort of publish, and they can have careers, but they don't break new ground. I've seen people who want to change the world with every experiment they do, and they tend not to get too far. There's somewhere in the middle where you just ask good questions and follow them where they go. Yeah, that's how I hope to do my career.
I've interviewed Michael Wall a few times. He's the entomologist over at the Nat, and because I love horror films, we've talked a lot about the horror that exists in the real bug world, and he keeps telling me, there's Hollywood's got nothing on what the natural world has. So in your field of study, is there something in genetics that you've come across that you think has the potential for a story idea or for a science fiction that you think like, they're missing it, but man, this stuff is so interesting and they haven't quite tapped in?
Yeah. So by the way, horror movies would be perfect for this. I had a friend who was telling me I had to push for Reanimator for this series. But I always played with the idea of what real mutant superpowers would be like. I can't imagine a mutation that lets me shoot lasers out of my eyes or grow wings, but mutations that allow me to take in more oxygen for breath, and which can change my metabolism, make me stronger, or change my vision, things like that. I feel like there's an interesting story in what a realistic mutant superpower could be. I remember there was a documentary about the drug war, and there was this one DEA agent who could see more shades of green than everyone else. And so they had him in the helicopter looking for, secret marijuana farms because he could recognize them and no one else could. It's just little things like that are really possible. And so, yeah, I always thought it would be fun to play around with, if someone could see infrared or something like that.
If you could give people a list of films in either films for adults or a different set of films for kids, what films might you pick, one or two, that you think this really will give you a sense of what science is like, or this is a film that I think could inspire you to be more interested in science?
Well, Contact's a fallback for that one in terms of what science is like. And I haven't seen The Arrival yet, but my impression is that this is also sort of a procedural. This is how you ask questions. Yeah, it's the movies that take, like the science fiction movies that take one premise as opposed to a whole bunch of crazy things that can happen, and then follow it to its conclusions. Those are the ones that get me excited, which it doesn't immediately sound like this, but like Minority Report was one where there was one main idea and they threw some future tech in there. And then it was just the consequences of that idea.
Look at me. Positive for Howard Marks. I'm placing you under arrest for the future murder of Sarah Marks and Donald Dubin that was take place today, April 22nd, at 0800 hours and 4 minutes. No.
Because I think that's how scientists think, is, here's a thing, and let's figure out what are the consequences of all of that. We make this big deal about how everything's a theory, and gravity's a theory, and the Big Bang's a theory. But the way we think about it is by then figuring out, making predictions. If this theory is true, what should we be able to see? And then we can test those predictions. So that's how we think about problems, because no one can ever prove the Big Bang to the level of fact. We just keep making predictions about what it means, what must be true if the Big Bang is true, and we keep testing those. If you like that kind of thinking, then science might be the right thing for you.
When I was speaking with Bradley Wojtek, he's going to be presenting Altered States. And he was talking about not just the science in the film, but the fact that scientists face certain legal barriers in terms of the kind of things you can do with mind-altering drugs or things like that. So in terms of genetics, is there a context that you can give people in terms of maybe either films that kind of explore ideas about what your barriers are? I mean, what kind of limits you in terms of what you're trying to do that are realistic kind of legal barriers to keeping you from maybe going as far as you might want to go, you know, the length you could go in a science fiction film?
Oh, yeah. And I mean, this is one of the reasons I work in fruit flies, because I don't have those same laws. They don't apply to invertebrates very much. I mean, there are a couple different directions. So mimic is one that comes to mind, right? Where, you know, you can tinker around with organisms in the lab, but then you release it into the wild and things can change that you wouldn't expect.
So you think your little Frankenstein's got the better of you?
I was hoping you could tell me. I really need to find some answers, Walter.
Yes, Susan. Is it answers you want from me? Or is it absolution?
You still think making the Judases was wrong?
3 years ago, I would have called it unforgivable. But I have 2 grandchildren who are alive today, probably because of you. It would be a tad hypocritical for me to pass judgment.
That's not an answer, Walter.
It's not an easy question. But as to the Judases, I think it's likely some survived. Evolution has a way of keeping things alive.
But they all died in the lab.
Yes, Susan, but you let them out into the world. The world's a much bigger lab.
Maybe it wouldn't actually turn into a giant moth creature, but weird things can happen, and that's a debate that's happening right now, where people want to use genetically modified mosquitoes to fight malaria and fight Zika by obliterating mosquito populations. The technology works, and so we're at the point of debating, is this something that should really happen or not? And is that a good idea? So yeah, the movie sort of was ahead of the question on that one. There's a lot going on now with, our ability to genetically modify people is certainly, the technology exists, even though we're not so much using it that way. And our ability to screen for mutations that we think are related to traits and diseases is there. I mean, now in a lot of cases, we can do it by just drawing the mother's blood. You don't even have to do something that is dangerous to the fetus. And so, Gattaca goes there, but I mean, there's all sorts of sci-fi Nazi offshoots about, creating perfect people. The island was also, a bunch of clones of the same people for some rich person to harvest. And that whole idea that we can just make clones of ourselves and the blood type will match, at the very least. Yeah, we probably shouldn't do that.
You brought up Reanimator briefly, which is one of my all-time favorite films, and also it became a stage musical as well, which was brilliant. But Reanimator brings up this notion of if you have this power to bring someone back from the dead, and in the case of the film, there are a couple of times where loved ones pass away and they can't resist this opportunity to bring them back. That notion of kind of like the power that science has and this kind of sense of a godlike power, that's something that gets explored a lot in science fiction.
It does. And Reanimator, Pet Sematary, the idea that, Frankenstein, which is, a direct inspiration for weird science, by the way. There's even the big storm that helps, create their perfect woman. Yeah, the idea that, scientists can play God and break the rules sometimes I wish we could. But, you know, the idea is out there a lot. And I actually think the idea is explored to the point that it might even be affecting our ability to actually work with the public. Right? I think it affects distrust of scientists. There aren't a lot of movies out there that show scientists as well-meaning people who are just trying to learn things. We're all mad scientists who have some goal against nature.
Well, there's that whole 50s set of sci-fi, which is basically science keeps going wrong, you know, Tarantula and them, and it's either there was a lot of radiation issues during the 50s, but any kind of genetic mutation that created these giant bugs and creatures were, but it was this sense of science has this potential for evil, even if it's not intentional.
Yes. So there's what, incredible shrinking men and giant women and giant ants and all of that. But there's the potential for evil, but then there's the potential for villainy and scientists as, you know, people who feel they know better. And I think Frankenstein kind of stories are behind a lot of that. But I think it really underlies some of the science versus religion narrative that's out there that makes it harder for us, I think, to work together on some issues. So it's well explored, but I'm not going to push people in that direction.
Well, Michael Wall brought up the fact that part of what he sees the reason for this program is that there is a sense that there's a kind of an anti-intellectual feeling going on in the country where people are either afraid of science or questioning science or not willing to kind of accept some of the potential it has. And that part of what this film series is about, despite some of the silliness of the films, is to let people know what science can really do and kind of the benefits that it can have.
Absolutely. I think anytime we can find an excuse to bring people together to talk about, you know, science and other issues and, you know, bring it all together, it's a good idea. I also, there's a program through the Fleet Center, which people can check out too, called Two Scientists Walk Into a Bar, which I did this once, you know, where I sat around with someone at Pizza Port and we just put up a sign and said, ask us questions. And, you know, people did. And some of the questions were silly and some of the questions were, you know, more personal and interesting. And, you know, hopefully we can give people a little insight into what is and isn't known or knowable.
So it sounds like you have a few films that you might want to follow up with if the Nat continues with this series.
Oh, yeah. No, we could do this a long time, I think. Yeah. Oh, I would do E.T. in Jurassic Park in a heartbeat. And I should see The Arrival, and then we can...
I love The Arrival for a number of reasons, but one of the things was we had been given this workshop at work about communication, and they gave us this list of things, like, what's the most important thing when you're communicating? And I looked at it and I said, well, obviously it's the words you choose, the most important thing. Apparently that was, 3 or 5 on the list after, I think, you know, body language, facial expressions, tone, things like that. And in Arrival, there's a point where kind of part of the storyline hinges on the interpretation of a single word and kind of and I was going like, yes, I feel vindicated that a word can be important, and the difference between a weapon and a tool could have a lot hinging on it.
And I like that kind of question. You know, the scientists don't know what they're doing. They're just trying to interpret what's going on. That's how I feel most of the time. I see these, you know, scientists on TV and film who can do incredible things very quickly and who always know what they're talking about. And I don't feel like that very much at all.
Well, the speed of science in movies is always amazing because, you know, they go into labs and it seems like a few cuts later we've got a massive amount of science that's just been completed, and in real life, that usually takes a very long time.
Yes, it does. And this is part of my problem with watching CSI, is they'll put something in a centrifuge and then the printer starts printing, and I'm yelling at the television, "There's no printer connected to that." And yeah, anything can be done in one night. I so wish that was true.
And there's paperwork involved in science.
Yes, there's a lot of paperwork involved in science. That's what the rest of my day is about, is paperwork.
So are there any other films that you would like to bring up or mention before we wrap this up?
Well, I think everyone should go see Real Genius again. That's an absolute winner. And we can all try to forget the scientists in Independence Day. So that's my compare and contrast, I think.
All right. Well, thank you very much for speaking with me.
Thank you very much. It's been fun.
Thanks for listening to another edition of the KPBS Cinema Junkie Podcast. Coming up next week, I'll be speaking with my partner in crime, Miguel Rodriguez of Horrible Imaginings Film Festival, about the eighth wonder of the world, better known as King Kong. And later this month, I'll have an archive edition featuring John Carpenter. And remember, Cinema Junkie is one of the co-presenters of Landmark Theater's Midnight Movies at the Ken Cinema. The Midnight Movies return this weekend, January 7th, with Howl's Moving Castle. And on January 17th, it's a special event Midnight Movie with writer, director, and star Tommy Wiseau appearing in person for The Room. So till our next film fix, I'm Beth Accomando, your resident cinema junkie.